Today we will study and reflect on Father Augustine's biography, From Slave to Priest. Although Augustine was born an illiterate slave, after the Civil War he overcame daunting obstacles to attend seminary in Rome and be ordained as the first black Catholic priest in America, becoming literate in 4 languages: English, German, Latin, and Ancient Greek, shepherding a parish first in his adopted city, Quincy, Illinois, then in Chicago, Illinois. You may ask, what can we learn by pondering his biography, From Slave to Priest? Augustine Tolton's tragic life provides us with 2 lessons. The first lesson is we can accomplish much with hard work, patience, and persistence, even when we face incredible hardships and discouragements. Although many people did encourage him and assisted him in achieving what he did, he was just not able to overcome all the obstacles and barriers he faced. So our second lesson is sometimes we just cannot do everything on our own. Sometimes even the strongest of us sometimes needs a little bit of help and encouragement. But Father Tolton's life was a great success in what matters most. Up to the very end, he did his very best to minister to the many in his parish who was destitute and in great need. And that matters more than any worldly success. And we might point out his story is a story of a different time and a different place that is just plainly interesting. We always like to select quotes from the author. At the end of our talk, we will discuss our source for the video and my blogs that cover this topic. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Sometimes these generate short videos of their own. Let us learn together. This story on Augustine Tolton grew from an illiterate slave to an educated priest who studied in Rome and was literate in 4 languages differs from the slave autobiographies of Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass, both of which we've already recorded on YouTube videos. The first difference is Augustine Tolton labored in relative obscurity, never achieving national fame as a civil rights activist, but instead preferred to quietly minister to the spiritual needs of his parishioners, mostly black, some white. This biography, or hagiography really, was written by Sister Carolyn Hemasath in 1973. She had learned of his remarkable ministry as a priest in Chicago in 1933, and she had interviewed over the years many who knew Father Tolton when he was alive, and she used as a primary source caches of correspondence that many people in that era left behind, which are so useful for writing biographies. What's most remarkable about the biography of Father Augustine Tolton is how many Catholic clergy, including priests, nuns, and bishops, both American and Roman, both in those years after the Civil War and during Reconstruction, were eager to help this barely literate former black slave gain a clerical education and encourage him and enable him to study for the priesthood. What is also remarkable is how many of these missionary priests from Germany and Ireland were willing, in homily after homily, month after month, year after year, to persistently, and without much success, to encourage their white parishioners to treat their fellow black freedmen with the dignity and respect that is due to all God's children. Many of these Catholic clergy, after Father Tolton attended seminary and was admitted into the priesthood in Rome, encouraged him in his ministry to his black parishioners in America, and how they came to respect him and even admire his life of faith and dedication, so much so that he is now being considered for canonization. What were Augustine Tolton's experiences when he grew up as a slave? The biographer tells us that the Catholic families in the border state of Kentucky that owned the Tolton family members respected, somewhat, though not completely, the human dignity of their slave families. Not only were their slaves well fed with decent clothes, the Catholic owners were concerned about the state of the soul of their slaves. They ensured that their slaves received religious instruction and permitted them to partake of the Catholic sacraments, which included the sacrament of marriage. The owners permitted the slave parents of Augustine Tolton to be formally married by a Catholic priest in the Catholic Church, which is just astounding for the day. The Tolton family was permitted to live together in one house, though the parents were owned by different masters. Amazingly, the slave children were recorded in the parish registry when they were born, including his mother, Martha Jane. Unlike many slaves in the Deep South, Tolton was not the last name of their master, but was a real last name. His owners were small farmers with only about a dozen slaves, as in this picture. Slavery was a little less brutal on small farms than on the huge plantations that were worked by hundreds of slaves. But the Toltons were still slaves, and they were still treated like slaves. And their master saw nothing wrong with treating them as slaves. Literate slaves were seen as dangerous slaves, quick to run away, so slaves were never taught how to read and write. Like all slaves, they could be whipped and beaten by their masters and overseers at will for any reason or no reason, and both the parents and their children were brutally whipped with lashes, many times by the overseer trying to whip more work out of them. Dawn to dusk, every day except maybe Sunday, they toiled in the fields. The biographer notes, under slavery there was a great estrangement, a total lack of communication, latent hostility which, at times did, break through the unvarnished surface with violence and murder. Slavery rested upon the ability to use unmeasured force, and every slave and master knew it. On at least one occasion, one or more slave families were broken up. The biographer tells us that when Augustine Tolton's mother was a child, the owner's daughter was married. On the day of the wedding, the owner went through his slave quarters and brushed paint on the forearms of some of his slaves, including the young slave girl who would be Augustine's future mother. This is done seemingly at random. The slaves were terrified. What would become to the slaves who were painted? Were they marked for sale? Would their families be separated? Sometime later, the slaves with paint marks were locked in the meeting hall, including Martha Jane. During the wedding festivities, the father of the bride brought the radiant couple to the meeting hall, unlocked the door, and exclaimed to the newlyweds, "Behold your dowry!" After the cart carrying the slaves and the newlyweds was hitched, Martha Jane's younger brother Charlie ran over and hugged his precious sister, as if somehow he could prevent her from being taken away. Well, the overseer brutally whipped him until he let go. Soon the Civil War began. The Toltons' farm in Kentucky was not far from the Union lines. Encouraged by his wife, Augustine Tolton's father joined the thousands of slaves who fled to the Union Army lines, where he signed up as a soldier, promising to send for his family when they were free. His family never heard from him again. After the war, they found his name on a Union Army casualty list. His last testament was that his children must not be slaves. They must learn to read and write, and they must have a better life than we had. Conditions worsened as the war progressed. The remaining slaves had to work ever harder to make up for the slaves who ran away. Martha Jane feared for the safety of her children. Slave traders were prowling for slave children to kidnap. The lashings increased and the civil order was disintegrating. One night, Martha Jane, with their toddler and two young children with a little bit of food, made their way to the Mississippi River. But freedom was many days' journey away. During the day, they mingled with friendly neighborhood plantation slaves. Confederate officials actually caught them, but by chance, some Union soldiers encountered the group, took the handcuffs off them, claimed jurisdiction, and let the slave family go. Finally, they found a dilapidated rowboat, and Martha Jane and her little family started rowing to freedom to the free state of Illinois. The biographer writes, in later years, Augustine Tolton often recalled the passage across the wide Mississippi. His mother, wholly inexperienced at rowing, struggled frantically with the oars and caused the small craft to veer crazily from side to side. Then they heard the angry voices of Confederate men shouting threats and curses. One of them raised his musket, firing repeatedly. Undaunted by the whistling bullets, Martha Jane ordered her children to lie flat in the bottom of the boat. The baby screamed from sheer bewilderment and fright. The boys did what they could to calm her, although they also cried all the way. Relying entirely on the protection of divine power, the determined mother clung to the oars and succeeded in placing a safe distance between the boat and the chagrined slave hunters. Although Martha Jane had been without food for days, she had the strength to bring her children to safety. Kneeling upon the ground, the valiant woman gathered the weeping children into her arms. Tears streamed down her dark cheeks as she said, "Now you are free. never, never forget the goodness of the Lord. Martha Jane and her children were found by a mixed black and white work crew at an Illinois wharf, feeding from their lunchboxes. When they gave the mother directions to Quincy, 20 miles down the road, for the first time in her life, Martha Jane heard herself being called Mrs. Tolton. And despite her weariness, that gave her new courage and a sense of dignity. They had to travel quietly. Confederate spies were known to kidnap any blacks they could find to sell back into slavery. Quincy, a river town with a population of 25,000, including 300 blacks, had many schools, churches, and factories, and was known as a haven for fugitive slaves. During their time at Quincy, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and then after a few more years, the Civil War ended. Both mother and her sons worked as stemmers in the tobacco factory 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, which, however, was a great improvement over working in the fields under the overseer's whip. Many of the black Catholics attended St. Boniface Church, where Father Schaffermeyer preached the gospel and sermon in both German and English. Augustine was the first black to attend the Catholic Church, and he learned to read and write in both languages. However, the white boys there were particularly cruel with their racial slurs. So, his mother switched to St. Peter's Church, where the German priest Father McGurr befriended the blacks, and where Augustine had fewer problems. Many of the white parishioners threatened to leave the church, however, if he were too friendly with the blacks, but Father McGurr pushed back, preaching sermons on how Jesus came to save all Christians of all colors. Father McGurk took a special interest in Augustine and one day asked him if he thought about becoming a priest. And if that came to pass, Augustine could be the first black priest in America, although the church had many black priests in Africa. But there was no enthusiasm in the Catholic hierarchy for a black priest in America. Since it would be impossible for Augustine to be admitted to college, let alone pay the tuition, he decided to give him private lessons in Greek, Latin, and theology, which meant that in a few years he could read and write 4 languages, while he was working both at the tobacco factory and as a church janitor. Year after year, Augustine studied his Aquinas in Latin and Greek. Year after year, German priests wrote letters trying to get him admitted to an American seminary. Year after year came back the response that people were just not ready for a black priest. Year after year, they had to counter hostility towards the black parishioners. As our biographer tells us, this dwindling black attendance saddened the priests. They expended every effort to prevent further loss of membership. They preached the gospel message of fraternal love, reminding their parishioners that Jesus said that as long as you did it to the least of my brethren, you did it to me. He who says he loves God and hates his neighbor is a liar. And if your brother feels you wronged him, leave thy gift at the altar and first be reconciled to your brother. Despite all these pastoral exhortations, both parishes suffered an almost complete alienation of black members. The priests tried something else. They started an apostolate for blacks, starting with a black St. Francis parish school. Augustine taught some of the classes, and he and his mother recruited many ghetto black children for the school. Also, our biographer tells us that Augustine frequented the city saloons where whites and blacks intermingled in daily and nightly bouts and brawls. He listened patiently, often far into the night, to a tangled woad drawled out by a bleary-eyed drunk. Although many of his so-called converts were temporary, he tried to convince many of these drunks to attend the Temperance Society meetings. Our biographer tells us the silent, unobtrusive activity of Augustine Tolton was largely responsible for the success of the apostolate to the blacks of Quincy. Both he and his mother were tireless in their efforts to reinstate members of their race in the church and to encourage others to study the Catholic religion. Finally, he received some encouragement. The year 1879 was a crucial year for Augustine Tolton. He was 25 years old. The regular tutoring by dedicated priests and nuns, his habitual self-discipline, his faithful observance of religious duties, and his 12 years of honest service as a wage earner had formed a character distinguished by determination, integrity, and leadership. Father McGurr told him why the Franciscan Seminary was so reluctant to admit him. These foreign priests were not accustomed to the American attitude towards the blacks. They deplored the fearful race hatreds and antagonism. But whites threatened them with fines and even violence when in some areas they befriended Negroes. This, as well as the many legal restrictions which control racial relations, are among the reasons why their superiors refuse black applicants, and the period of Reconstruction in the South has intensified popular resentment against blacks. Some Franciscans think that their work in the cause of Christ would be hindered, and that their membership would decrease drastically, and their influence would be diminished if blacks were seen in their ranks. The priest then asked Augustine if he would like to be a missionary priest in Africa, and he responded that he would go anywhere the church asked him to go. His priests wrote lengthy, glowing records of recommendations with the results of his education, and wrote to the head of the Franciscan order in Rome. Finally, Augustine was accepted to attend the Pontifical College in Rome in 1880. A crowd of people bade him well at the train station, family and friends, old and young, black and white, priests, college students, and school children. In Rome, Augustine finally felt welcome. Our biographer tells us, in a flood of relief and new happiness, Augustine discovered that the 70 or more fellow seminarians represented many races and nationalities. All of them accepted him unconditionally and sincerely. The discrimination and prejudice that he had so often suffered in America all his life were unknown in the Pontifical College. He experienced the security of equality and justice, a sense of dignity and worth, the comfort and companionship of friends, the joy of mutual charity and benevolence. He profited by the regular helpfulness of classmates with whom he could study and discuss, give, accept, and share. He never felt lonely, unwanted, or out of place. He was treated as a person, as a member of the church, as a child of God. For 6 blissful years, Augustine studied in Rome before he was ordained to be a priest with the special red sash of the Pontifical College of Rome. Perhaps his ministry would not have been filled with frustration if he had been sent to Africa as a missionary priest. But the cardinal told him, America needs black priests. America has been called the most enlightened nation. We will see whether or not it deserves that honor. If America has never seen a black priest, it must see one now. Augustine bowed his head and covered his face with his hands. Back to America? Back to a country where I was a slave, an outcast, a hated black? Must I go back to America where I was not wanted as a priest? Where seminaries and religious orders were not ready for someone like me? Lord, I can conquer ignorance, weakness, and heathenism. But Lord, I cannot counter the racial hatred in America. In July 1886, Father Augustine Tolton was installed as the first black priest in America, serving the Negro St. Joseph's Parish in Quincy. In the first few years, he had a measure of his success. The membership increased somewhat, and he had both black and white parishioners. Since the blacks were either poor or downright destitute, they could not really support the parish. The financial support of the white Catholics was critical for the success of St. Joseph's. Our biographer tells us, Father Tolton won the hearts of young and old alike. The secret of his success lay in his innate simplicity and genuine love for all with whom he came into contact. He never tired of telling his people that God cared for each one of them and that he had a deep concern for the welfare of every one of his children. But the white priest of St. Boniface was facing a mountain of debt and was jealous of the white support Father Tolton was able to attract. After several years of obstruction, he forbade the white Catholics from supporting or even attending the black parish of Father Tolton, proclaiming that his ministry was only to minister to the black Catholic. Other pressures from Protestants and the unending misery of living in poverty also contributed to a drastic drop in membership by the black parishioners as well. The death knell came when the local bishop ordered him to refrain from ministering to whites. Father Tolton was then granted permission to minister to the first black Catholic parish in Chicago, St. Monica's Church. The church was started in a storefront in the ghetto of Chicago. Construction began on a permanent church, and though it was finished to the point where services could be held, construction was not completed in his lifetime. Unlike the situation in his former parish in Quincy, Archbishop Feehan of Chicago permitted Father Tolton to solicit funds to support St. Monica's from the white congregations, as his black parishioners were employed mostly as servants and were mostly destitute. His mother was able to move to Chicago to assist him, but he started having health problems and did not have the energy he had in his youth. We were looking for pictures of the black community in Chicago, and we came across these pictures, which include the Chicago race riots of 1919. Many U.S. cities in the first decades of the 20th century experienced race riots, where white mobs vandalized and burned down black houses and businesses, and sometimes murdered and raped black citizens in the colored neighborhoods. Rarely were whites prosecuted for these crimes. Our biographer tells us, in spite of his fatigue, Father Tolton made the daily rounds of his parish, stepping over the uneven brick pavements and cobbled sidewalks and climbing steep rickety stairs. All too often he was horrified by the squalor, the ravages of poverty and disease, the prevalence of dissipation and vice. Many of his people were ex-slaves and totally illiterate. Others suffered just as severely from moral deprivation. Day after day, Father Tolton was seen coming in or out of the shacks in the rat-infested hovels and tenement houses. He listened compassionately to complaints of unemployment, desertion, injustice, and depravity. Father Tolton knew how to bring hope and comfort to the sick and dying. He knew how to mitigate human suffering and sorrow because he himself had experienced the lash of the slave driver as well as the lash of the white man's tongue. In July 1897, when walking home from the train station, as the temperature hit 105 degrees, Father Tolton fainted and soon died. Thousands paid their respect at the funeral of this beloved priest who had worked alone for so many years. He was only 43 years old. That was sudden. He died so young, with so much promise. One day we are here, the next day we are gone. How can we make sense of this precious soul taken away from us so suddenly? We can only pray the prayer we found that honors Father Tolton from the Diocese of Chicago. O God, we give you thanks for your servant and priest, Father Augustine Tolton, who labored among us in times of contradiction, times that were both beautiful and paradoxical. His ministry helped lay the foundation for a truly Catholic gathering and faith in our time. We stand in the shadow of his ministry. May his life continue to inspire us and imbue us with the confidence and hope that will forge a new evangelization for the church we love. Father in heaven, Father Tolton's suffering service sheds light upon our sorrows. We see them through the prism of your Son's passion and death. Our main source for this video, of course, was the autobiography of Father Tolton. From Slave to Priest, we found it to be very readable, and we encourage you to fill in the details of his life. And we would also direct you to the website of the Archdiocese of Chicago, which documents the progress for Father Tolton's cause for his sainthood. Please click on the link for the description of our blog on Father Tolton, and please click on the links for other YouTube videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul. Thank you.